A simple dinner turned into a shocking confrontation that no one saw coming. It started like any other night at a local restaurant, but when the waitress served the wrong dessert to a black woman, things quickly escalated. What began as a small mistake became a heated argument, and before anyone could react, the waitress did something outrageous. She hurled the cake straight at the woman. But what happened next was even more unbelievable. The woman's husband, a seemingly quiet and unassuming man, stood up. His calm demeanor hid something powerful, something that would change everything. As the cake splattered against the woman's face, the entire restaurant went silent. The waitress, clearly flustered, didn't realize she had just triggered a chain of events that would reveal her own shocking truth. The woman's husband, now standing tall and with a determined look in his eyes, stepped forward. No one knew exactly what to expect, but the tension in the air was thick. The waitress, on the other hand, was about to discover that the man she had just disrespected was not someone she should have crossed. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay tuned to find out how one man's hidden power changes everything in this jaw-dropping story. The man who had been quietly enjoying his meal up until now didn't seem to be the type to make a scene. His demeanor was calm, almost serene, but there was something about the way he stood that sent an unsettling chill through the restaurant. His wife, wiping cake from her face, tried to keep her composure. The anger in her eyes was clear, but she didn't speak a word. She knew something that no one else did. Her husband wasn't just any ordinary man. As the waitress, flustered and embarrassed, stood there waiting for a reaction, the man took a slow, deliberate step toward her. His presence seemed to grow larger with each move, and everyone in the restaurant watched in tense silence, unsure of what was about to unfold. The waitress, clearly on edge now, kept glancing nervously between him and the door, but she couldn't run. She knew, deep down, that there was no escaping whatever was coming next. The woman's husband said nothing, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He had a quiet intensity that seemed to grow as the seconds ticked by. What had seemed like a petty argument over a cake was turning into something much, much bigger. Something none of them were prepared for. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the man reached the waitress. Her hands trembled slightly, still holding the tray she had been carrying, now forgotten. The diners around them were watching with curiosity, whispers starting to ripple through the crowd. No one knew exactly what was happening, but something in the air had shifted. The tension was palpable. The woman, sitting at the table now with her head down, still silently wiped cake from her clothes, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. A quiet resolve, a readiness for what was about to happen. The waitress, growing visibly uncomfortable, finally spoke, though her voice wavered. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to what?" The man's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, sharp as a blade. He wasn't shouting, but every word was deliberate, carrying weight. "Throw a cake at my wife? Humiliate her in front of everyone?" His tone wasn't angry, yet it held power, an undeniable force that made the entire room feel smaller. The waitress shifted on her feet, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't just that he was calm, it was the way he carried himself, like he was in control of everything happening around him. He had the kind of presence that made even the bravest feel like they were standing on the edge of something dangerous. Meanwhile, the woman's gaze slowly lifted from her hands. The whispers in the restaurant had died down, but they still hung in the air like a heavy fog. The tension grew thicker, and the woman's husband, sensing the moment had come, took another step closer. His expression softened, but the power didn't fade. He had never wanted this to escalate, but now that it had, there was no turning back. "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with," the man said, his voice still steady. The words weren't a threat, but they felt like one. The waitress, unable to form a response, stepped back, her nerves getting the best of her. And just like that, the entire restaurant felt like it had fallen into a dangerous silence, waiting for something to happen, but no one knew what. The woman's husband hadn't raised his voice, but there was a growing sense of urgency, like the calm before the storm. What was his next move? What had triggered this transformation? The answer, everyone knew, was far from simple. The air in the restaurant was thick with anticipation, every eye fixed on the man and the waitress. Time seemed to stretch, the minutes dragging on like hours. The waitress was now visibly shaking, her usual bravado gone. She could barely look him in the eye, and her breath came in quick, shallow bursts. Something about his presence had completely unhinged her, leaving her at a loss for words. She glanced nervously at the exit, as if considering running, but she didn't move. The woman, still seated at the table, stood up slowly, her hands clenched into fists. The cake on her clothes was a small thing now, a distant reminder of the humiliation she had just suffered. What mattered more was the scene unfolding in front of her. She knew her husband's true power, but seeing it in action like this was different. It was a rare moment when his quiet strength felt almost overwhelming. A low murmur started to ripple through the crowd. Some people were starting to catch on that this wasn't just about a cake or a misunderstanding. There was something far deeper at play here, something none of them could have anticipated. The man stood still, his eyes never leaving the waitress. It was clear now that he wasn't just upset. He was holding something back, something huge, and no one knew when or how it would break. As the seconds passed, the energy in the room shifted again. The waitress's face grew pale as her hands shook uncontrollably. She finally took a hesitant step back, as though trying to retreat into the safety of the kitchen, but her feet were glued to the floor. Her gaze darted between the man and the others, seeking help, but everyone in the restaurant seemed frozen, caught in the same uneasy trance. The man's eyes, sharp and steady, followed her every move. The woman's breath caught as she noticed the tension in her husband's posture. She knew him well. This was a side of him that only she had ever seen, but now the entire room was witnessing it. It wasn't anger that radiated off him, but something far more unsettling, control. The kind of control that made everyone feel as if they were standing on the edge of a precipice, not knowing what would happen if they took one wrong step. The waitress's legs trembled, and for a moment, it seemed like she might collapse under the weight of the situation. The silence stretched, thick with anticipation. Would she break first? Would someone else intervene? Or would the man take the final step, crossing a line that no one, not even the waitress, could have predicted? In that instant, the room held its breath, teetering on the brink of something explosive, but no one knew what would come next. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, something unexpected happened. The front door of the restaurant swung open, and a man walked in. His presence was striking, almost commanding. He was tall, wearing a suit that fit perfectly, but it wasn't his attire that caught everyone's attention. It was the way he moved. He had an air of confidence, but it wasn't the kind of confidence you saw every day. It was the kind that made people stop whatever they were doing and take notice. At first, no one paid much attention, but then the man's gaze landed on the husband, and for a split second, everything changed. The husband's eyes flickered for just a moment, and the slight shift in his posture didn't go unnoticed. The newcomer smiled slightly, a knowing grin, as if he was aware of something that no one else was. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill down your spine. The waitress, already rattled by the situation, looked up in confusion. She didn't recognize him, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made her feel even more exposed. Her hand instinctively reached for the nearest glass, as though she could shield herself from the sudden shift in energy. The man in the suit walked toward the husband with deliberate steps, his eyes locked on him like they were old rivals. It wasn't just a casual glance, it was a recognition, something deeper. The entire room seemed to hold its breath again. What was going on? Who was this man, and what did he want? The woman stood up beside her husband, a protective instinct kicking in. She looked between the two men, her mind racing. She had never seen her husband react like this to anyone, especially not to a stranger. The newcomer was no ordinary person. Something about the way he carried himself, the certainty in his movements, told her that this was no coincidence. This man was here for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it was about to change everything. The two men locked eyes, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. Everyone in the restaurant could sense it. Something big was coming. A hidden past, an unspoken rivalry, or perhaps an old debt that had finally come due. But before anyone could make sense of it, the man in the suit spoke. "You didn't think I'd find out, did you?" His voice was calm, but it had an icy edge that made everyone shiver. The husband's expression didn't change, but the air in the restaurant shifted once again. There was something more to this than just a dispute over a cake. It was the beginning of something much darker. The man in the suit's words hung in the air, and the room seemed to pulse with the weight of his revelation. The husband's jaw tightened, and for the first time, a flicker of something dark, flashed in his eyes. The tension was unbearable as the two men stood face to face, neither of them backing down. The woman glanced between her husband and the newcomer, her heart racing. She knew her husband's past wasn't something he shared easily, but this was something deeper, something from long before they met. She had a sinking feeling that whatever was about to unfold would tear everything apart. The man in the suit took a step closer, his gaze never wavering. "I gave you a chance to fix this, but now there's no turning back." The husband's voice, quiet but steady, broke the silence. "I told you I'd handle it. This isn't your fight anymore." The crowd was on edge, barely breathing. The woman could feel her pulse in her throat. Was this a showdown they couldn't walk away from? Then, without warning, the husband turned to the waitress, who was still standing frozen, watching the confrontation unfold. "You wanted to know who I am?" he asked, his voice cold now. "I'm the one who has the power to make all of this disappear." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, unassuming envelope. The room fell completely silent. He held it out, almost casually, toward the man in the suit. "Take it," he said, his tone calm but unmistakably firm. The man in the suit's eyes flickered with recognition. He glanced at the envelope and then back at the husband, hesitating for just a moment. "You don't get to play this game anymore," he growled. The tension reached a boiling point, and just as everyone held their breath, the unexpected happened. The man in the suit snatched the envelope from the husband's hand, but instead of opening it, he threw it across the room, straight toward the waitress. She caught it instinctively, the shock written all over her face. The room went deathly quiet as she stared down at the envelope, unsure of what was inside. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling. The contents were not what anyone expected. A stack of photographs, each one more damning than the last. The waitress's eyes widened as she recognized faces from her own life. People she thought were long gone. But there was one photograph that stood out, one that made her blood run cold. It was of her, the very same woman who had thrown the cake. Her life was entangled in a web that no one had seen coming. The husband's voice broke through the silence once more. "I didn't want it to come to this," he said, his gaze flicking toward the woman at his side. "But you made me show my hand." The man in the suit's face twisted in disbelief as he took in the truth unfolding before him. But before anyone could speak, The woman stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. So it's true. You both were connected. The final twist came in that moment as the man in the suit looked at the woman, and his cold demeanor shifted for the first time. He was no longer the enemy, but a long-lost ally. The truth came crashing down, and everything that seemed impossible to understand fell into place. The connections, the secrecy, the history, it all made sense now. The room was left in stunned silence. The waitress, now understanding the gravity of her actions, stood frozen, still clutching the envelope. The stakes were higher than anyone could have ever imagined, and yet there was something even more powerful at play here than revenge or power. The truth, once buried, was finally out.